Well, the Melbourne Globalist has the pleasure of interviewing US Ambassador Jeffrey Bleish, the outgoing ambassador as of September 12th. Thank you for taking the time out to answer a couple of questions for the Melbourne Globalist.
Well, thanks, David. Thanks for having me here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Since taking up the position of US Ambassador to Australia in 2009, you have been involved in a range of issues: security, free trade, science, human rights, to name just a few.
Yeah.
What would you say has been your proudest accomplishment during this time?
Honestly, I think if I could reduce the work that we've done over the last 4 years to just one or two accomplishments, then I've probably failed, because the nature of the relationship is more like a marriage. It's no one says, in the last 4 years of your marriage, what are the one or two things you're most proud of? It's hundreds of things that we do, small and large, together. So we've had some extraordinary moments. We've had the President address your Parliament, and the Prime Minister address a joint session of Congress and describe a vision for how we create long-term sustainable prosperity in the Asia Pacific and strengthen our alliance. I think the working together to land the Mars Space Lab, a rover on the surface of Mars, look at rescuing people by helicopter out of Gympie in Queensland during the floods. Think about working together to load water cannons onto C-17s, Royal Australian Air Force C-17s here. They're American water cannons. We flew them up to Fukushima to cool off one of the reactors and really save perhaps tens, hundreds of thousands of lives in Japan and prevent a catastrophe. And it's kind of hard to choose, which of those, or just the trade records that we've set in terms of exports and investment in each other's countries and tourism. And I mean, there are so many that I wouldn't pick one. And I think if I could, then I really haven't done enough.
How have you seen the US-Australian relationship develop during your tenure as ambassador?
Yeah, I think it's been a very good 4 years. You try to put these things in context, but when I arrived, there were real concerns about U.S.-Australia relations here. People expressed concern about the global financial crisis. The U.S. was in a recession then. There were concerns about the U.S. being so enmeshed in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan that it simply wouldn't have the bandwidth to invest in the Asia Pacific at a critical time when Australia really needed U.S. commitment in the region, and the U.S., for its own interests, needed to be reinvesting in this region. And I think at that point, sort of late 2008, early 2009, support for the alliance was about 62%. Since then, support's up around 82%. According to the Lowy polls, and the U.S. got out of recession. It's actually revolutionized its energy mix and has brought manufacturing jobs back. The Dow went from, when I arrived, it was 6,500. Now it's over 15,000. And we completed our mission in Iraq. We wound down our efforts in Afghanistan, transitioning authority over to the Afghan people, which Australia and the U.S. will do at the end of this year. And we nonetheless were able to invest in this region and really strengthen the alliance in every dimension, diplomatically, economically, and in terms of our security alliance. We modernized all of it. And so on those things, when I look back, I'd say it's a very good trajectory. And I think it's a tribute to our two countries that in dark times, when it was really challenging, we didn't lose faith in each other. We kept the momentum going forward.
The strength of the US-Australian relationship was clearly solidified when, following the attacks of September 11, the Howard government invoked the ANZUS Treaty in order to send troops and other military resources to Afghanistan and Iraq. As both a lawyer and a diplomat, how do you view the Howard government using ANZUS, a treaty that was designed originally to protect the security of the Pacific, as a justification for Australia's participation in those two conflicts?
Yeah, well, I think the ANZUS Treaty, its purpose was to support our mutual security, and that we would look out for each other in terms of particularly existential threats to our nations. And the war on terror was precisely that. I mean, Australians died in September 11 attacks. Many Australians died in the Bali bombings, and Afghanistan was the locus for the leadership of Al-Qaeda that was responsible for those attacks. So I see the invocation of the ANZUS Treaty as appropriate because it was relating to a common interest that affected our mutual security, which was to eliminate these non-state actors, these shadow terrorist groups that were operating within boundaries of different states.
One of the Obama administration's key diplomatic initiatives has been its pivot or rebalance to Asia, a move that's been widely interpreted as a counter to China's rising dominance. What do you say to critics who argue that Australia's increased military cooperation with the US, most noticeably in its participation in the US Global Force Posture Review, is not in Australia's best interest and is instead an example of what Malcolm Fraser has termed Australia's subservience to the United States?
Yeah, well, I'd start by saying that Australia is not in any way subservient to the United States. If anyone were in my job, you'd know that people in Australia have no difficulty saying no to things that they don't think are in their own best interest or in the country's interest, and it's a completely independent, sovereign power that operates based upon its own conclusions about what's in its best interest. Australia is, 12th largest economy in the world, and it behaves like one across the board in all the multilateral fora and also with the United States. With respect to the argument that our rebalance is, for one thing, it's not about any one country, and I think that's one of those narratives that people have tried to create in order to sell books and create controversy, but it's not what the rebalance is all about. The center of economic gravity, growth, and dynamic change is right here in the Asia Pacific. And we have spent the last 70 years trying to create an environment in which that could happen. Bringing countries like China into the WTO and doing other things that would help establish an environment in which prosperity really could occur in the Asia Pacific. At this sort of pivotal moment, it would be crazy for us not to be investing even more, whether that's economically or diplomatically or in terms of security arrangements to make sure there's free trade and freedom of navigation and those sorts of things. If you look at what we're doing, all of our actions are consistent with that, and I think that's why Australia has been so welcoming of it on both sides of the aisle, both Labor and Liberal National Coalition. Economically, we're trying to develop partnerships among multiple countries where they will lower trade barriers and they will trade more freely, but they'll also trade with greater transparency, trying to eliminate corruption, ensure that property is protected and that there's a rule of law so that if there is a dispute, things get worked out peacefully. And that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a perfect example of that, where now we have 12 different countries in the region working together. Diplomatically, the U.S. has signed every treaty you can sign, and we signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, so now we're part of ASEAN. We joined the East Asia Summit at the principals level. We've joined the Indian Ocean, the IOR ARC, which is a regional conference. We have reinvigorated APEC when we were chair of it in Hawaii. And then in terms of our, the security piece, which tends to get, I think, disproportionate attention, what we're really doing is trying to stitch together more exercises where we all learn to train together. And it's not just with the Australians. The North is a great place for us to also train with Malaysians, Singaporeans, Indonesians, and all the other countries in the region. We've invited China, we've invited lots of other countries to train with us. And the whole purpose is for us to learn each other's capabilities, intentions, and also get to know each other. Because if there's ever a misunderstanding, you want to know who to pick up the phone and call and make sure that things don't go in the wrong direction. And that's one way that countries traditionally have kept the peace. So all those things are of one piece. They're all part of a refocus, a rebalance to create an environment for greater peace, prosperity, stability in the region.
Do you think that the rebalance to Asia is a knee-jerk reaction on the US government foreign policy priorities, given that, as Syria has demonstrated, you need to be everywhere at once? Without being the world police, can you be a global presence at the same time?
No, I mean, the U.S. Can't be everywhere at once, doesn't want to be everywhere at once. But we have certain core interests in some places, and then we have much deeper interests in other places. So we are investing heavily in the Asia Pacific. If you just look at where our trade is flowing, where our money is flowing, where our attention is focused, the Asia Pacific rebalance reflects that. For example, we'll be moving our Navy from a 50-50 split between the Atlantic and the Pacific to 40% in the Atlantic and 60% in the Pacific. So those are real shifts in priorities to reflect where we see the greatest economic opportunity and the greatest need for our assistance. I think at the same time, there are interests that exist, but we're not going to get involved in every dispute in the world. We have certain core interests. So with respect to Syria, we've been clear over the last 2 years of the civil conflict. We would provide humanitarian assistance to victims of that conflict, but we wouldn't get involved in other ways except if one of four things occurred. If there was an attack on one of our allies and they were threatened, if it was acts of genocide that we could help prevent, if there were if it became a sort of a breeding ground for terrorism and terrorist attacks that threatened our own security, and then, of course, if there's use of weapons of mass destruction, whether it's nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, or biological weapons, those are red lines that exist for the world community because we're all parties to these conventions. Those are the triggers, but that is that's a much narrower set of interests than the interests that I was describing in the Asia Pacific.
There has been a lot of recent controversy regarding electronic surveillance by US government agencies such as the NSA. Does Australia have anything to worry about?
No, Australia really doesn't have anything to worry about. I think, for one thing, the types of programs that were described are ones that I think we're all pretty used to in our normal lives. I mean, if you go into a bank, you expect that the bank will have a record of basically metadata. Someone at this hour came in wearing this color shirt and this color pants and left at this hour. And they don't know anything about you, they don't know about your transaction, they just have a video recording of it. And in the event that there was a bank robbery, that might be helpful to know, whether you're a witness or whether you were, potentially a perpetrator. It's good to have that information as part of an investigation. But you'd still have to go to a court. You'd still have to say, okay, here's the tape that we have. We'd like to get a warrant to get more information. The same thing happens in cyberspace. There are unusual patterns of phone calls to particular areas at particular hours for strange durations, things that don't look like normal conversations, that are consistent with drug transactions or terrorist transactions. And that's the kind of thing that is sort of looked for in these algorithms. But it's not like people are looking to see, if you're sending cat videos or something like that. It's a very sort of normal process, and it's just doing what we see in real life in cyber world, which is basically how cyber works. It's becoming more and more a reflection of how people behave in real life.
Some have said that the main issue Australia faces is what the political scientist Glenn Snyder has identified as the aligned security dilemma. That is to say, client states are faced by the dual fears of abandonment by major power protectors and entrapment into making commitments they might not otherwise like to make. How do you view this dilemma in relation to US-Australian relations?
Yeah, I don't really see it as a dilemma. I mean, my sense is that any partnership can go off kilter if the two parties aren't seeing the world the same way and working together closely. Like just as any marriage could go off kilter. But in general, marriages work because both sides recognize the need to, kind of stay close, stay focused on what matters, and not be drawn too far one way or the other. The way I look at the major challenges for our alliance are things where neither one of us could solve the problem alone. So, for example, I think the biggest challenges we're likely to have in this region in the next, few decades will be first, resource scarcity. You're going to add 2.5 billion people to the middle class in this region, and where are you going to have enough food, water, energy to provide for them all? You won't be able to do that unless multiple countries cooperate. So no one country can take care of this alone. We all have to work together. Similarly, cyber and satellites are sort of the new frontiers for potential exploitation, conflict, and compromising our security. If people hack into them, or if they do things that are dangerous with satellites that just kind of break the central nervous system of our of the cyber world for us. And for that reason, we need to work closely together, because neither one of us alone can solve that problem. And I think those are the third set of challenges really are probably outside of the bounds of any one country as well. They're non-state actors. It's pirates and cyber hackers and drug traffickers and people smugglers and human traffickers and weapons proliferators. I mean, these aren't part of one country. They exist in shadow networks that cross many borders, and you need partners across many borders to help solve them. And so that's why the alliance works for our countries, because we see those same sets of challenges. We know that neither one of us can solve it alone, and we're better off solving it together with a really capable partner.
China has overtaken the US as the largest consumer of Australian goods. Do you feel this will negatively affect the US-Australian relationship?
No, we think we think it's very good that Australia has the relationship that it does with China economically. Trade with China has made Australia stronger. Australia's success is America's success because we're betting on Australia. We're the biggest investor in the world in Australia. In fact, compared to China, who's the number one trade partner, we're the number 3 trade partner, but we're the number 1 investor with 5 times the foreign direct investment of China. And if you take what's called the bilateral portfolio investment, that's sort of all the investments between 2 countries, it's over $1 trillion, which is 30 times the equivalent for China. So we're still the largest economic partner for Australia, but we want Australia to prosper, and having these strong trade relations with rising countries is very good for Australia, and we think it's what's good for Australia is good for both of us.
What do you see as being the main challenge for the next US ambassador to Australia? And what advice
Cleaning
would you
up
give
all
them?
my mistakes. I think that'll be a huge challenge. I think every ambassador has the same initial set of challenges. One is that you've got a very strong, positive relationship, and you just want to make sure that you tend to it, that you don't take it for granted, that you invest a lot of energy, because it is such a big, robust relationship. It's very busy. As I said, we work on hundreds of issues across the spectrum. We have 23 federal agencies here, including things that people never imagined we work on together. Bushfires. We're counter-seasonal, so we send our firefighters here, and you send during your summer, and you do the same during North American summer. Invasive species. Our Interior Department works on issues like that. H1N1 and other flus are counter-seasonal. We work together on that, in addition to all the big issues that you see. So I think it requires a lot of energy. And fortunately, my successor, John Barry, is tremendously energetic, really smart, great judgment, well-connected in D.C. I know he's going to do a terrific job. But the biggest challenge is that every day is challenging. Every day there's something big going on, and there aren't a lot of nights when you can go to bed and be confident that you won't be woken up in the middle of the night. And I've had quite a few of those, which is probably why I think I used to be taller and have more hair when I started this thing.
And just lastly, Mr. Ambassador, do you have a message for members of the Melbourne Globalists who may be interested in careers in international affairs?
I would encourage you to do it. I encourage you to do it without worrying about the financial aspects of it. For a whole variety of reasons. The people I know in the Foreign Service, I came from the private sector, I hadn't been a Foreign Service professional. They are some of the most inspiring people I've ever met. They are smart, hardworking, incredibly committed, and they go through some very challenging circumstances, but they do it with a lightness and a joy that comes from doing something that you're passionate about. And I think we need more people doing what they're passionate about on behalf of our countries. I think second thing is, even if you don't end up making a career of it, having that perspective, understanding the world better, is going to be critical to being effective in anything you do in the next generation. So the world literally is getting smaller and flatter. and as a result, it's critical for anyone who wants to play a major role, whether it's domestically or otherwise, that they really understand the world and engage internationally. So I would say, with my worst American attempt at being an Aussie, good on you. But really, I think it's a great thing to do.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time out to answer a few questions for the Melbourne Globalists.
Well, David, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.